Okay, hi guys. So today I am back with another video and I am in my own room this time. Last time I was in my brother's room and it definitely did not match what I was going for, if that makes sense. So my bed is not made, but besides that, my room is pretty clean. You can see my Polaroid wall and my Kageyama. Right up there, he is my husband, so sorry to disappoint anyone else who was thinking that. So today I am going to be talking about the hi-fi murders. And it is a very sad case, but it does have somewhat of a good outcome. So before I get into it, today I will be crocheting again, and I'm going to be working on my blanket. I have been working on this for a long time, but it's so big that it just takes so much time. So I will be crocheting this, and so far, this is what I have. And it is a pico crochet blanket, so it's got the little dots on it. But I think it's really cute, it's super easy, it's super fun. So I'll be working on this while I tell the story. So the start of this case of the hi-fi murders is, it is a 45-year-old case, so it's like pretty old. And this case is so gruesome and so like harsh that they teach it in training. So the beginning of this case takes place in the hi-fi shop, and this hi-fi shop was a music slash stereo shop just with a lot of music equipment, and it was located on Washington Boulevard, Ogden in Utah. The hi-fi shop was owned by a man named Brent Richardson. And before even getting into the real antics of this case, there are 6 men that commit the crime, and 3 of the men were never identified. April 22nd, 1974 is when this case does take place, and that's where we're going to be starting today. So this particular morning, there were 2 people working in the shop, and there was 18-year-old Michelle Ansley and then 20-year-old Stanley Walker. So Michelle was born on January 24th, 1956 in Ogden, Utah. Michelle was born to her mother, Laura Weeks Ansley, and then her father, William G. Ansley. Michelle did have an older brother named Dan Ansley. Michelle was a bookkeeper, but she did get the job at the hi-fi shop only a week before the murder, and I think she just wanted a little bit extra cash. And Michelle did attend Bonneville High School, and she was graduating in just 4 months, and then right after that graduation, she was engaged to be married, and she was making plans to have that wedding very soon after. And Michelle was described as beautiful, outgoing, and cheerful, and very supportive of all her friends. Just the day before the murder, Michelle was going home and telling her mother just how excited she was to be engaged. And then 20-year-old Stanley Walker was born on March 19th, 1954. And Stanley was born in Ogden, Utah to his parents Orrin Walker and then Joyce Walker. He did have a younger brother named Lynn Walker. And Stanley was described as tall, muscular, handsome, and then very athletic. Stanley was known to be very helpful in the community. He has volunteered as a basketball coach, and he was even known to help young men and coordinating activities for them. Stanley attended the local Weber State College, and he was Mormon. Stanley was described as a very excellent young man and then very into his religion. So on this particular day of April 22nd in 1974, both Stanley and Michelle were working, and they both had actually picked up their shifts. But Stanley had switched shifts with another manager, and Michelle had just traded shifts with someone else. The fact that they were picking up these shifts is really scary because they both weren't supposed to be there, and they would never have encountered this murder. So at this point in the day, Michelle's friend Courtney Neisbat comes into the store. Courtney asks Michelle if he can park his car in the hi-fi back parking lot while he runs next door and gets some photos.
At this point, I do pronounce every single time Neisbat, and it's Naisbet. So every time I say Neisbat, I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Michelle said it should be okay, but she wants to make sure, so she goes and asks Stanley, and he says, yes, it's fine. Courtney was 16 years old, and he was born on September 25th, 1957. Courtney was born in Ogden, Utah as well, to his father, Byron Hunter, and his mother, Carol Neisbat. He was described as a kind and loving brother, and he was a member of the Latter-day Saints Church. Said to have shared his father's love of scouting, and he had earned his Eagle Badge and his Golden Palm Award. Courtney was said to be a very, very strong student, and he loved science. Courtney also loved flying. He was said to have taken flying classes all around the school and to be very, very excited about it. And he had successfully completed his first flight on the day of the murder. At this point is when things start to go a little bit downhill. Courtney leaves to go get his photos from the next store, and right at this moment, 2 vans pull up right at the back of the shop, and they have 6 men in the vans. And they pull up right at the back of the shop where if they needed to make a quick exit, they could. 2 men remained in each of the vehicles driving, ready to leave as soon as possible. There was a man keeping a lookout, and then there were 3 men that headed into the store. And one of the men driving was identified as Keith Roberts. And had been planning this for weeks, but they were worried about not getting caught and they just wanted to have the exact perfect time. At this point, they weren't worried about getting caught and they decided that it'd be fine because there was no CCTV footage. At this point, the three men barged into the store with 25 caliber handguns and they pointed them at Michelle and Stanley. Michelle and Stanley were then forced into the basement of the store and they had their hands and their legs bound. And then started going upstairs and they started going through the cash register, getting all the heavy equipment, anything that they could make a profit out of, and they started loading it into the back truck. They were loading, the truck drivers were still ready to leave. At this point, Courtney does tragically start to come over to the hi-fi store and he was gonna thank Stanley for letting him park his car there. And at this point, he's confronted with the men in the store and he is forced down to the basement and bound as well. And the hi-fi shop was so expensive in equipment that if they robbed this store, it would be equivalent to robbing a bank. In total had already divvied up what they would each get, and they would each get $5,000. So at this point, Orrin Walker does actually become nervous about his son, Stanley Walker, and he decides that he's gonna go check up on him. Orrin Walker was 43 years old, born September 17th, 1930. So at this point, Orrin walks into the store, and I don't know why they didn't already lock the door from Courtney coming in, but as Orrin walks in, they take him down to the basement, but they don't bound him immediately. And at this point, we can go ahead and talk about the murderers and the two men that we know were in the store at the time. So the first man that we're going to talk about is William Selby, and he was 19 years old at the time of the murder. He was born in 1955 in Louisiana. He was described as tall, muscular, well-built, and known to have RBF. Selby did not have a good childhood as he was abandoned at birth by his father. He committed his first burglary at 15 years old, and then he went to Job Corps soon after, and he committed a theft and was then put in jail. And that's all I could really find on William Selby. There wasn't much to go off of as it was so long ago and all the news reports really didn't talk much about his childhood rather than just what he had done. Now moving on to Pierre Dale Selby, and this was the second man that we know was in the store. He was described as being well built but not as big as William, and he was known to have a receding hairline. 21 years old and known as disassociated and empty. Pierre was being described as always getting into some kind of trouble. Although it weren't for lack of trying, his parents did try to instill something into him, but he just never learned. He was born in 1952 on the Trinidad Island. Pierre was known as a compulsive liar and did not react well when things did not go his way, but this was not unknown to his parents. In June 1970, Pierre decided to leave the Trinidad Isle and then moved to the United States. He first went to New York and then Brooklyn, and then he decided he wanted to join the Air Force, and then they put him in Utah. Before this case even takes place, Pierre had already been suspected of another murder. Pierre was rooming with a guy named Jefferson. Pierre had actually been in the apartment at a point where Jefferson had lost his keys, and they had known to have been looking all over for them. And at one point the next day, when they know they had been missing, Pierre found the keys just out of nowhere, and Jefferson had suspected that he had stolen them. Jefferson suspected that Pierre had taken the keys and then went and duplicated them so then he would have his own pair and then gave it back to Jefferson. So at this point, Jefferson decides to change all the locks on his apartment, and he decides to confront Pierre and ask, like, did you take the keys? And after Pierre denies it, and then in between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., Jefferson was found dead. Jefferson was found with a knife so deeply lodged into his neck that you could only see the handle sticking out. That was how gruesome this murder was. And there simply just was not enough evidence for Pierre to be convicted for this crime, but he was always suspected to have done it, and they really, really wanted to convict him for it. And it was said that during his time with the Air Force, no one liked Pierre because of his sullen attitude, and he was just a complainer. So him and William actually got quite close because William was sort of an outcast, and they grew closer together when they both were a little bit socially unacceptable. And at this point, they had asked to be reassigned together. And this was more of seen as Pierre's idea and then William just following him. Pierre was so much older than William, it always kind of seemed that way because William was 19 years old and Pierre was 21. Even though the 2-year age gap isn't as big as you might think, it has a lot of experience in those 2 years, and Andrew definitely seemed like he was a lot more of a kid than Pierre. At this point, we're gonna go back to the hi-fi shop and continue where we were with the murders. Michelle starts crying, which is very understandable. She starts getting emotional, and Orrin's still standing there, just not bound, with Michelle, Courtney, and Stanley all in front of him on the floor, tied up. And at this point, Pierre tells Andrew to go get something from the van. At this point, William returns, and he has drain cleaner with him, but the victims don't know this. They can't see it. It's in a bag. This drain cleaner was called Drano. This drain cleaner had sodium oxide, which breaks down chemicals in your body. Also known to have been used on corpses to help decomposition. And this drain cleaner has been known to break down hair, grease, and even meat in just minutes. Drain cleaner can do permanent damage if it's not taken care of properly. For this murder, Pierre had actually come up with the idea of using drain cleaner because he had just seen the movie Magnum Force, where a female had been forced to drink this and she had passed away within just seconds. Pierre's thought in this was that the drain cleaner was easily accessible, quiet, and would not be a lot of trouble to clean up after. But what Pierre didn't know was that the Magnum Force movie was not reliable. It's a movie. Most murders aren't going to happen just like it does in the movies. And so although drain cleaner can be very, very dangerous to you, it's not going to kill you instantly like the movie. But what drain cleaner will do is once you drink it, it'll go down through your esophagus to your stomach and it'll start burning holes. And then once it starts burning holes, at this point you can't swallow anymore because it has taken over your esophagus, and then it'll start burning your organs and your insides slowly. At this point, if you have drinking it, you most likely have died from suffocation or the pain. And the death time has been known to linger from 5 to 20 minutes. At this point, Pierre is pouring the liquid into a cup, but the victims still don't know what it is. And then he tells Oren, Stanley's father, to then pour it into the victim's mouth. And once Oren refuses, he is then beaten and bound as a punishment. Carol Neisbat, which is Courtney's mother, becomes worried about her son, and so she goes to the photo shop to see if he's there, and once she realizes he isn't, she goes to the hi-fi shop and begins to look for him. And once she comes in, she notices immediately how messy the floor is, and she knows a robbery has happened, but she stands there for a second just kind of looking around, and before she can register what happens, Pierre and Aunt Williams have now burst into the room and they're pointing their guns at her, and they force her down to the basement as well. And then at this point, Pierre and Williams decide to lock the door, which I do not know why they decide to lock it now after they've had 3 extra victims come in. If they wanted this to be a quiet and quick robbery, they could have done this so much simpler, not by having all this happen. It was so unnecessary. At this point, it does start to get a little bit gruesome. Pierre and Williams force them to all drink the liquid, telling them it is vodka crushed up, and so that way they'll just pass out. So they begin to drink it, and immediately they obviously know this is not vodka. They start getting second-degree burns on their mouths, and they all start screaming in pain. Because their screaming was so loud and they were in so much pain, Pierre begins to get very angry, and he tries to duct tape their mouths shut so that way they cannot scream anymore. Because of the blisters and the peeling around their mouths, the duct tape is just not sticking and it falls off. But after a few minutes, they were in so much pain that they could no longer even make any noise, and they couldn't scream. At this point, Stanley, Courtney, and Carol all go into shock, and they just start convulsing on the floor. And Michelle, while in her emotional state, she seemed to have cried a lot and maybe didn't consume as much of the liquid, so she was still aware of what was going on around her. And Oren was being very smart. Whenever he was forced to drink the liquid, he was able to have some dribble out of his mouth, and so that way he didn't consume as much as the others. Pierre then begins to worry because they're not dying like the film, which is just stupid on his part, because why would you think that a film is going to accurately describe exactly how our murder is going to go? So he begins to worry because how loud all their screaming was. He was afraid it might have had alerted someone else and that they might come to check on the store. At this point, William goes upstairs, but Pierre is very angry, so he then takes out his gun and he shoots Courtney and Carol and Stanley all in the back of the head, and then he aims for Oren. He misses Oren's head just by a little bit, and Oren at this point is fake convulsing, so he can maybe survive, but they notice that he is still alive and they shoot him again. And then Pierre yells up to William to wait for 30 minutes upstairs and to not come down, and then he turns to 18-year-old Michelle Ansley and tells her to remove her clothes. Brings her to a corner, and then he rapes her. After raping her, he then tells her to use the toilet while still naked, and he just watches her. And now Pierre tells her to get to the floor, and he brings out his gun. Michelle then starts to yell that she is too young to die, and then starts begging for her life, and then he shoots her anyway. I can't even imagine being Michelle in this case. Personally, that's my worst fear, is to be kidnapped and raped, and I couldn't even imagine being in that situation where you're so emotional and so much pain and trying to go along with their orders to maybe survive somehow, and then in the end you went through all of this just to die. Pierre, after he's done shooting everyone, he notices Oren is still alive by the grace of God, but he doesn't want to shoot him again because he's worried about the noise going off, although he already fired like 4 bullets, so I don't know why one more at this point would alert that extra, sound in someone. But he then proceeds to take a wire and wrap it around Oren's neck and tries to suffocate him. He starts fighting against him to the point where Pierre cannot even suffocate him at all. And then instead, this part is also very gruesome, I want to warn you, he then takes a ballpoint pen He clicks it and shoves it into Oren's ear, and he shoves this pin so deep that it rips out through his neck. Then finally, William and Pierre decide to leave after they've decided they've done enough damage and they've got all their equipment. So they go upstairs, they go into the vans, and they proceed to leave. Before moving on, I just want to address a couple things that I haven't really gotten to say my opinion on. First off, the fact that they're robbing the store and they did all this damage when they literally just could have come in with guns, told them, give me the money, give me the equipment. I would have bet that Stanley and Michelle probably would not have devoted their life for the store. Most people are going to die for a store that they're working at as a part-time job. So they probably would have just say, okay, here's the cash register, here's everything you want, we'll pretend nothing happened. Why did they have to tie them up and then kill them? And not only just shoot them, but they poured drain cleaner down their throat. They shoved a ballpoint pen in someone's ear. That's insane. It's so excessive. It's so stupid. And then the fact that they're all doing this for $5,000 in total, that's not gonna get you somewhere in life. I've always thought if you're gonna steal, let's say you're gonna steal a big amount, why not go for the big, and why go for 5K? You're taking all these people's lives for $5,000. Is it really worth it to you? I mean, I'm assuming it was because they did do it, but there was just such a way that they could have done this without killing all these people. They dragged all these people in when they did not have to, and the fact that they didn't lock the door just shows they really didn't care that much about getting caught. They just wanted to get the money and go, and they wanted to make all these people suffer for getting in their way. Okay, sorry for going off a little bit of a rant there, but I just feel like I needed to get my opinion in before I moved on to the next, part of the case. So at this point, 3 hours have passed since William and Pierre have left, and Joyce Walker and Lynn Walker, the mother and brother of Stanley, have now decided that they're gonna go check on him too, because his father's now been gone for a long period of time. So once they enter the store, just like Joyce, they notice that the store is a mess and that something has very clearly happened. They know a robbery has happened, so that's very clear. They then hear moaning coming from downstairs, so that's where they go run to check. Joyce runs to a pay cell phone where she can go and call the police, and Lynn, Stanley's brother, runs downstairs and breaks the door open, and he then begins to see all the bodies on the floor. He sees his dead brother and then his barely alive father laying on the floor with a puncture wound out of his neck from where the pin came in, and then bloodied head where the bullet hit him. And then he sees Michelle, who is also dead, and Carol. And at this point, I feel like it's not really addressed upon how Lynn handles the aftermath of these murders, but I can't even imagine walking up and seeing your father and your brother, thinking they're probably both dead, and then seeing 3 other bodies, and how traumatizing that must have been for him. Carol, Courtney, and Oren are then taken to the hospital, hoping they might survive. Stanley and Michelle were a lost cause at this point. They both had been pronounced dead at the scene. And shortly after arriving at the hospital, Carol was then pronounced dead as well. So it was just Oren and Courtney who might have a chance to survive. And it was said that Courtney's father had stayed in the hospital with him every single day until he got better, holding his hand. And Courtney did eventually get better after spending 266 days in the hospital. And this can be seen as a huge victory, and I'm sure it was. This man is fighting for his life for almost a year, and he survived. That's 266 days that William and Pierre stole from Courtney. So going back to the crime scene, immediately once the police arrived, they were disgusted and just blown away about how gruesome this place was, and they immediately sent out a press release the next morning. So only after a couple hours of this case being sent out on the news, was an anonymous tip that had called in and said that he was on the Air Force Base with William and Pierre, and he had heard them talking about robbing the hi-fi shop. And the anonymous tip had even claimed that he heard William say that one of these days, I'm going to rob the hi-fi shop, and anyone who gets in my way, I will kill them. Which just kind of proves my point that they didn't even really need to kill these people, but because they were in their way of getting their money, that they had to kill them and they wanted to make them suffer. A lot of people had suspicions that the anonymous tip caller was someone who was involved in the case and had thought maybe Pierre and William had gone too far. But there's a lot of reasons for someone being an anonymous tip. They maybe don't want to get involved. They don't want to have their name out there with the case, and they don't want to be involved with all the aftermath of what goes on and being interviewed and questioned. I don't necessarily think it could have been someone that was with them. I mean, there's a possibility, but people anonymous tip all the time. It's not like it automatically means that they were involved. So a couple hours after the morning press had been released, 2 boys went dumpster diving close to the Air Force Base, and they had found all 5 identifications of the people who had been either murdered or still recovering, and they had recognized all the identities from the people on the news, so they immediately called in the police and told them what they found. So at this point, it's April 23rd, the next morning, only a day after the murder, and the police already had an anonymous tip called in leading to the 2 men, and they already had the 2 boys at the Air Force Base where the 2 men worked and had found all the identities. So it seemed at this point they already had a lot of leads leading to William and Pierre. So when the police arrived at the Air Force Base the next day to collect the evidence, they decided to kind of put on a little act to kind of scare the men at the Air Force Base, knowing there's going to be a crowd watching them collect the evidence, all the workers being there, which is kind of weird. You think they've kind of shut down the Air Force for that day to get the evidence, but they did not, I guess. So there was the crowd and of all the workers there, and Pierre and William were in that crowd. They just hold up the identities of all the victims and kind of watch, gauge the reaction to see of what they're going to do. And obviously all the men are looking at the police, being very engaged in listening to what they're saying about these victims, but 2 men in the back were pacing and whispering to each other, and this was William and Pierre. At this point, the police had a pretty good idea that these men had done it, and they wanted to go ahead and go up to them and ask them what they knew about the Hi-Fi murders, and they decided to arrest them then and there because of how suspicious they were acting. These men are literally stupid. Like, how could you be this obvious about a murder? You did not do anything right. Like, if you're going to murder, you think you would kind of be smart about it. The 2 men's apartments were searched, and they had found flyers for storage units, and once they went and searched the storage units, they had obviously found all the Hi-Fi equipment. And then at this point, they had charged the 3rd man they had known been identified in the murder, and this was Keith Roberts. And there wasn't a lot of information about how they knew Keith Roberts was there or exactly what his position was. Just know that they had charged another man named Keith Roberts. Those are the 3 men: William Andrews, Pierre Dale Selby, and then Keith Roberts out of the 6 men that were there. We're gonna go ahead and get into the trial. So both men had actually had their trial at the same time in November of 1974, and they were charged with 3 counts of homicide and murder in the first degree, along with aggravated robbery. At this point, the court documents I was reading had said there were 300 exhibits of physical evidence and 66 witnesses. It's like, did they even do anything right at this point? Like, they left every single piece of evidence that could get them caught right out in the front for the police to just look at and open. Some of the evidence included the van that they drove, the Drano bottle, and then all of the equipment in the storage unit, and it had all their fingerprints on it. And the state had even pulled in some psychologists to determine if they were mentally ill or not, and they were perfectly fine, fit enough to stand trial. At this point, Pierre's background was dug into, and they were able to provide his background as some evidence that he was a bad person. While at the Air Force, he had failed to report his places of duty. He had written 2 checks out to himself from the Air Force with their money, and he unlawfully took another person's vehicle. It was stated that he was minimally productive and did not have a lot of talent. Then going into William Andrews' case, it was very similar to Pierre Selby's, but also had a different aspect to it. William Andrews is hard to determine about what kind of punishment he should get from the court. Personally, I know what I feel about him and what kind of punishment he should get, but it was confusing because he did not shoot the victims. He did not take that action of, killing them, no longer having them be alive. So should he get the same charges as Pierre? That was the question. It was kind of determining how much he did and what he should get punished for. William Andrews had even claimed that he did not know the Drano would kill them whenever he poured the cup out for them, but that doesn't make a lot of sense because he was talking about the Magnum Force movie with Pierre, so why would he be giving them this Drano besides to torture them? I don't really see how that would help his case because let's say you didn't want to kill them, you're still giving it to them to severely hurt them then. Andrews even claimed that he was a tag-along and he was just following Pierre and did whatever he told him, which still doesn't make you innocent and off the hook. You're still committing a murder and a robbery. I don't really know if that makes it any better because now at this point you just have no backbone and you're just doing whatever this next murderer says. But at this point, they were found guilty on all 5 counts that they were charged with, and the death penalty was imposed. And at this point, the jury had unanimously decided that they would be given the death penalty in June of 1992, and they were sentenced to the death by firing squad. But after this death sentence was imposed, The NAACP had actually said that they did not agree with this decision, and they wanted William and Pierre to now have life in prison without the possibility of parole and no death sentence. The judge had decided that the two men did not meet the criteria of getting the death penalty, and so they just deserved life in prison. Because the judge and the NAACP had said that they did not meet the criteria, they were just sent to death row. And while they were on death row, they were said to have been hated by almost everyone there, specifically a man named Gary Gilmore, and he had said to have severely hated Selby and Andrews. Gary Gilmore was on death row at the same time as William and Pierre, and he was given the death penalty while they were both all on death row together. And while he was being sentenced to death, his last words to them were, "I'll see you in hell, Andrews and Selby." And despite the NAACP's efforts to not have them sentenced to death, they were actually overturned, and very soon after, they had a date set for them both to die. Pierre was sentenced to death on August 28th, 1987, and Andrews was only sentenced to death just 5 years later. So Pierre was sentenced to death by lethal injection. I don't know why it changed from the firing squad to lethal injection. Maybe it's just easier, didn't really give context to that. But he died by lethal injection, and his last words were, "I'm just going to say my prayers." And Andrew's last words were, "Thank you so much to those who tried to keep me alive. I hope they continue to fight for equal justice even after I'm gone. Tell my family goodbye, and I love them." I find it very hard to, I don't necessarily agree with the death penalty. I know it's a controversial topic, but I don't necessarily agree with it. Even though I think these men, deserve hell for what they did, I don't necessarily agree with that. That's a whole other topic. But even listening to them say this, I don't have any forgiveness for them, not a single bone in my body. But it is upsetting thinking about their families and how they still have some emotion, and then just, how they died. It is sad. Like, it's a very sad thing, even though it's something that we don't necessarily are ever going to forgive them for. It's hard sentencing someone to death. So at this point, I have not talked about William and Pierre as I could have. In Andrew's last words, he did say he hopes that they continue to fight for equal rights. Now, I don't know if that confused some of y'all. The equal rights, why would he be saying that? Like, what equal rights? Well, how are you kind of picturing Pierre and William? Like, what did you picture them to look like? Because I never described their looks or anything about them, just how they were built and physically, not. What I'm trying to get at is Pierre and William were both black, and this takes a huge part in the case. But I did not want to address this part of the case until afterwards. I wanted to put the full case in there, have the outcome of everything, and then everyone can have their own opinion, and then you can think what you think about them being black after.
It's the best way. I don't think there should be a difference. Like, if you find out they're black, you shouldn't change your opinion about the case or anything. Like, it should not change your opinion about what you thought about them at all. Like, that was not the best wording. I just kind of meant, like, have your own opinion about the case, about them being black, but it shouldn't matter.
Because personally, if I didn't know they were black while reading this, my first thought would have been, okay, they're white men. Like, whatever, basic, you have that stereotypical murderer look, that you picture when you picture a murderer. And I kind of had that, Ted Bundy, that's kind of my ideal, what I picture a murderer to look like, not black men. That's just not what comes to my mind when I think of murderers. And so that takes a huge part in this case, and I do want to address it because it's like really big in the case, but I wanted to tell the case first. That way there would be kind of an unbiased opinion on how you felt about them because you didn't know they were black till after. But during the trial, there was a huge emphasis on their race, and specifically like in Utah at the time, they had said that they did not get a fair trial because they were black and there was prejudice and the whole jury was white and that they were being racist towards them. And that was a huge setback for the case. Like, so many times they would try to convict them and it was constantly like, oh, we're black, and like, we're not getting a fair trial and this isn't fair, like you're treating us unfairly. And it was consistently going back and forth about their race, about whether they're being prejudiced or not towards them. So with that being such a big, part of the case and the race thing, I think I talked about this last time to Nathan Dunlap. I think it's very low for them to try and go for the race card. I truly don't think that they believe that it's because of their race. It If it was a white man, I think he would have been sentenced the same way. I do think it's hard when there's, 12 jurors who are white and Christian. It is a hard thing to look at and say, okay, they're not being racist. It's hard. It's back in the 1970s. Like, it's very hard to look and say they're not being racist. I get that part, because it's like, you think back to 1970s and you're like, yeah, there's probably race out there. There still are today, and it's 2022. But in a situation of a murder, whether it's a white or black man, I think they deserve the same sentence. Now, necessarily I don't agree with the death penalty, but I still think they deserve life in prison without the possibility of parole, and they should spend that time rotting in hell. I don't care if you're black or white. It has nothing to do with it. You committed a crime, and because you're black, you're now saying that we're not treating you fairly, and I just don't see that as the case. Race doesn't change who you are on the inside. It may change your experiences on life and how you view things and all that stuff, but it's not going to change who you are inside, like deep inside. Who you are is not going to have to do with your physical attributes. Whether William and Pierre were white or black, they were committing this murder. That didn't change the fact. Who they are inside. They're murderers. They're equal people. Their race didn't change that. I really don't know what they expected. Did they expect, life on parole because of this? Or just a lesser sentence, because then you're getting unequal treatment because of your race, like you're saying white people are. I don't know what they were expecting. I'm not saying everyone does this, obviously. Like, this is only this case and this specific case and how they're treating it. It's just upsetting to see that they want to pull that card out of like, oh, we're being untreated fairly because of our race, when it's just, you committed an awful crime and you need to be punished for it. Why did you think you wouldn't get that punishment? You took 3 out of 5 lives. What did you think was going to happen?
Strange thing about Selby, he didn't like to go out very much. He was basically a loner.
Selby told the Utah Board of Pardons that he was drunk or on drugs much of the time before the murder. Andrews contradicts that story.
If he drank, I never saw him drunk.
Andrews and Selby planned to rob the hi-fi shop together as they were getting out of the Air Force and leaving the state.
Take the money and run.
Andrews says he knew and liked victim Stanley Walker, a clerk at the hi-fi shop.
The only one I knew, like I said, was Stanley, and I did like him.
He said he joked with Walker during the robbery.
I remember joking with Stanley about how good a sale he had done with me on the equipment, how he had created a desire in me to have this equipment. I held the gun, and he gave me the Drano. He held the cup. I poured it into the cup, and he handed it to the people. I was never under the impression that the Drano would actually kill anyone.
So the aftermath of this murder with Orrin and Courtney surviving, I would like to touch on that just a little bit, so that way you know they survived and how they're doing. Orrin Walker was actually able to walk very soon after the murder and attend church again, which is very important to their family, and he was known to have a very well life after this murder. And I'm sure physically he was fine, but I'm sure mentally he struggled a lot. And Orrin then had a large pink scar on his forehead, and I'm sure that was a reminder of what had always happened, which is really sad. But Orrin had always been a religious man of the LDS church, but people had said that after the murders, he had specifically said that God had a plan for him, and that even though his son died, he had a purpose to live, and he was going to live it out for God. And Orrin did die on February 13th in 2000. But it seemed like Orrin really made the best of his life after this tragic event. It's never easy. I can't even imagine being in a situation where you're only one of 2 people that had survived, and maybe even like suffering with guilt with that. Like, how do you even cope with that? But it seemed like he was a very religious man, and he turned to God after, and even though he was already religious, he relied on God even more and was able to overcome that with him. So Carroll Nisbat is a little bit of a different story. He did survive and lived somewhat of a normal life after the murders. I think he had a lot more PTSD than Orrin.
I lost myself, my identity, and they affixed to me a new identity, which not very many people can associate with.
He couldn't wear a watch for ages. because he couldn't stand anything around his wrists. It's just a day-to-day hell. And Courtney is one of the most fantastic and gifted people I've ever known. And to see this going on in this man is hell in itself.
I am going to read a quote from Courtney's doctor about him recovering. Courtney is here, but in some ways it's almost worse than when he died, because he is not normal and he never will be normal. So Courtney at 29 years old had trouble doing common actions, like daily actions that most people do not have trouble with. It said that he was unable to cope with the stress of it all. Nice Bat's esophagus was so badly damaged that he couldn't really speak for a while, and even throughout his life he had trouble speaking. He has a lot of stomach pains and sometimes still can't even eat properly. Courtney also suffers muscular weakness on one whole side of his body from the event. And another quote from his father that I'm about to read. Courtney is doing the best he can. He always has trouble taking care of himself. He'll always have trouble taking care of himself. Courtney is not really well. He never will be. So Courtney did die at the age of 44, and this was said that he had died due to the issues from the events of the case. And it said that he had lived the best life he could, from that. But it's just very sad because I want to be upright and honest. Watching these clips, I was crying. Like, watching Courtney with his wife and reading that quote that just reading that quote from Courtney's father is just heartbreaking. Like, the fact that there's nothing you could change that, and he's honestly just lived the rest of his life struggling with these things caused by these men that didn't have to do it. They just had purely evil intent. I love how I'm literally talking to no one and I still am nervous as hell. But that is all I have for today. I think overall the case is very sad. It's very hard to find a positive outlook, but if you can, Orrin and Courtney survived and they made the most of their lives. Courtney got married, Orrin was able to preach more, and he was still living out his love for Jesus. These things that, although they tried to take away, they still weren't able to kill these two people, and they lived a mostly successful life. Courtney died early, but he still lived the best of what he could. Overall, they're very sad cases, and I think that these men are evil. They're very evil. But overall, I hope you enjoyed the case, and I'm so thankful for y'all listening to me. Feedback is appreciated. And I still don't have an outro, so I'm not trying to copy. I think I just did that because I've seen Matt do it so many times, and now I'm started doing it. And the hi-fi shop was owned by a man named he
You literally hear me talking. Please go.